Hello and welcome. Hello! Welcome to another episode of Torn Book Club on June 28th, 2015. Camera's a little high, but oh well, we'll just deal. You can still see my face. That's the important part. Welcome. I am your host, Saruman, aka Josh. And normally on the book club for the last few weeks, or last few months actually, we've been doing a chapter by chapter breakdown of the Silmarillion. But this week, we're taking a little bit of a break to go over our book of the month for June, which is The Neverending Story by Michael Ende. And we can get all of our giggles out now that a book called The Neverending Story was written by a guy with the last name Ende, or Ende. It's spelled Ende. So it could be one or the other. It's a German book. Many of you may be familiar with this book from the movie that came out in, I want to say, 83, 82. Let me check. 84. Okay, 1984 was when the movie came out. And I think many of you out there, like myself, were introduced to this story through that movie. It was directed by Wolfgang Petersen and focuses on probably about the first third of this book, but it's a completely self-contained story, has a solid beginning, middle, and end, but the book, because it is the never-ending story, keeps going on even beyond that ending. But I wanted to go over this book because it's a fun little bit of nostalgia. Aravandi saying I've never seen the movie. I should watch it sometime. I would. I think it's a movie that still really holds up. I watched it recently because of course a lot of people are doing last year a lot of people were doing screenings of it because it was the 30th anniversary. So yeah, everybody's saying I feel, or Temple saying I feel old. So do I, because I remember seeing it in the theater when it first came out twice in a row. This was back in the days when if you went to the movies and you decided just to hang out in the theater for the next showing, nobody really cared. Like, you could just do that. And so my parents and I, we went to see it, and we missed the beginning. So we just hung out in the theater and waited for the next showing so that we could watch the beginning, and then just stuck around to watch the whole thing again because we liked it so much. So this is a really imaginative story. It's a very bizarre story. So I'm going to go over the first third of it. I'm gonna try not to be as spoilery as I was last month with Childhood's End, where I pretty much revealed all the major plot points. Because with Childhood's End, you really do need to discuss some of the major reveals in order to discuss the story. With this, not so much. Like, you can go over just like plot points and keep spoilers to a minimum. So I'm going to try to keep spoilers a little lighter this time. So of course I'm going to talk about what's in the movie, which again is only about maybe the first third of this book, and when we get into the rest of the book, I'll keep the spoilers light. But I'm also going to talk about differences between the book and the movie, because the book sets the stage so the story can continue, whereas the movie sort of brings it to a very dramatically satisfying close. So there are differences here, some of which make sense, some of which are just a little kind of weird. But for those of you who haven't seen the movie or haven't read the book, I'll go over the basic plot line. It's about a boy whose name is Bastian. His full name, hilariously enough, is Bastian Balthazar Books. And Light of the King is here. Hey! Welcome, Light of the King. You're finally here for one live. Unfortunately, it's not a Silmarillion episode. But so this this book is about a boy named Bastian who is really kind of a misfit. He's an outcast. He's constantly bullied at school. Um, he has a very overactive imagination and doesn't really know how to contain it. So he tries to he expresses himself with like basically just blurting out weird names or talking about strange stories, and so of course he gets bullied a lot for this. um Light of the King just said, I love the NES. That took me a minute to realize you were talking about the Neverending Story and not the Nintendo Entertainment System. That's where my brain goes. But okay, so Bastion, after a day of being bullied and tossed into a garbage can, he finally just he gets out and he's running away, and he runs into this nondescript bookshop. And in the bookshop is a bitter, angry, cynical old man named Carl Conrad Coriander. And they have a very sort of very brash discussion. Coriander doesn't really want him in there. He doesn't want him. He's basically trying to get him to leave, and Bastion is taken by the cover of this book that Mr. Coriander is reading, and he's sort of set aside so that he can go answer a call. And Bastion sees this book called The Neverending Story, and it's got this beautiful symbol of two snakes eating each other on it, and he's entranced by it, and so against his better judgment he steals the book and then goes to school, and but plays hooky in school by going into the school's attic, locking himself in, and sitting there and reading the book. And as he reads the book, then he starts reading an adventure and sees that it's actually mirroring a lot of what he is experiencing himself, and begins to realize that he is a character in this story. And so the story that he's reading is about this magical world called Fantastica. Now, I know in the movie it's called Fantasia. I'm going to go with the book's name of it, which is Fantastica. There's an extra C in there. Why they made that change, I don't know, other than the fact that Fantasia was a famous Disney movie at that time, and there might have been some name recognition there, or maybe the name Fantastica just sounds goofy. And that's the other thing, as we get into this, there are lots of very weird sounding character names in this. So Bastion is reading the story of this world Fantastica, and it is slowly being torn apart. And there are delegates of all sorts going to the leader of the world, who is known as the Childlike Empress. And the world is being torn apart by this thing, or actually it's not a thing, it's called the Nothing. And it's basically just complete emptiness that is slowly overtaking the world in pockets. Like the characters describe seeing a lake that is there one day, and then the next day it's just not there. And it's not that the lake has dried up and there's a hole. It's not that suddenly there's a forest or something else that is replacing it. it is simply there is nothing there. Like there is just emptiness there. Uh, Temple is saying, I think the names and such are influenced by German words and pronunciations. A lot of the made up words look German. That could be. Um, I'm not. I'm not overly familiar with the German language. I took it a little bit in high school, and that's sort of my extent with it. So, um, that's certainly a valid point, Temple. And yeah, so so the nothing is taking over the world, and everybody is going to the childlike empress to appeal to her to say, what can we do? And that's when they all learn that the childlike empress herself is sick and dying, and she entrusts her amulet, which is called the Orin. Hello, Dwina. Um, she, Her amulet is called the Orin, which is this symbol of the two snakes intertwined and eating each other. Um, she entrusts it to one of her doctors and tells him, "You have to go out to this to these people. They're called like the green skinned people of the plains. They're kind of an analog for Native Americans." And she tells him, "You need to find a warrior named Atreyu and give the Orin to him, and tell him to find the cure." And so he does this, and he finds Atreyu, who is out on a hunt. And it turns out uh, Atreyu is he's just a kid. Um, and so this throws the guy, but he still he still believes that he has this was his orders by the Empress. So he gives Atreyu the Orin and trusts him with this tremendous quest to find the cure for the Empress and save Fantastica. Uh, so um, and so so Atreyu takes the quest, uh, and he takes his horse Artax, and they go off, not knowing where they're going to go, not knowing what they're going to find, and just hopefully that the Orin will guide them. And so they have a couple. Um, they have a couple encounters. Um, the the first one being in this area called the Swamps of Sadness. And I think most of you are pretty familiar, who have seen the movie, are familiar with a lot of what I'm talking about. Um, the Swamps of Sadness are exactly what they sound like. They're ugly, awful swamps, and the longer you stay in them, the more depressed and despondent you become. And in there, he is told to find Morla, the giant tortoise, the ancient one, and she'll be able to tell him what to do. And so he eventually finds Morla, who is a gigantic tortoise living in the middle of the swamp, and Morla is also just as depressed as anything else, and she basically says to him, I know how to cure the childlike empress, but why should I tell you? What difference is it gonna make?" Aravandi is asking, "Are the Swamps of Sadness anything like the Dead Marshes?" Kind of, in a very abstract sense. They are swampy, they are marshy, and you get unduly influenced while there. But it's not as clearly defined as the Dead Marshes are, because the Dead Marshes are clearly haunted by the thousands of ghosts of dead soldiers, whereas the Swamps of Sadness is just sad. And it's kind of hard to tell. Like, I sort of look at it as it could be either way. Either it was caused by Morla's own depression for just being there for so long, being alone and depressed for so long, she just infected the land around her. Or it could be that that's just the way that part of the world is, and Morla succumbed to it. Um, Now, either way, eventually, Morla tells him, you can learn more about uh, the Empress. Like, um, Morla basically tells him something vague along the lines of, the Empress's sickness is tied to the Nothing. Um, and to find more information, you need to go to this creature called Igramul the Many, and then from there, and I can't remember if this happens before or after. Atreyu's horse Artax succumbs to the depression of the Swamps of Sadness and sinks in, leaving him behind. And anybody who has seen the movie remembers this scene as just one of the most harrowing things from our young cinema growing up, because it really is just like a terrifying, heartbreaking scene where Artax, this horse, is slowly sinking into the swamp, and Atreyu realizes it's because he's depressed, and he's begging and pleading, and he's screaming for Artax to cheer up and to think about him and to continue on for him. And it's just this horrible, awful, heart-wrenching scene where Atreyu is just completely devastated by this. Now, here's the difference in that scene between what we see in the movie and what's in the book. In the book, Artax is a speaking horse, which means that entire scene in the movie is just Atreyu crying for Artax to cheer up while Artax is just slowly sitting there silently sinking. That's a lot of S's. Uh, so um so in the book, Artax can talk. And so now imagine that scene with Artax speaking and saying, "I know I'm gone. There is nothing more for me. The quest is in your hands. I believe in you. This is not for me anymore." Imagine how much more harrowing that scene is with Artax being able to vocalize his despair. And it's a absolutely tragic scene. And from there, Atreyu is able to... He has to go into the mountains, these forbidden haunted mountains, to find Igramul the Many, which is this legendary, terrifying demon. And he does, and it turns out that Igramul the Many is basically a giant swarm of bees. A giant swarm of bees with a collective consciousness. Try to imagine... I hate to say this because it's a really bad movie, but imagine the end of the Matrix Revolutions when Neo is speaking to the computers, and all the squiddies or whatever they were, they come together and sort of form this baby face that speaks to Neo. It's kind of the same thing with Igramul, only it's just thousands and thousands of bees. And they're this swarm, and they come together, and they form a face, and they speak to Atreyu. And Igramul says that... and not only that, Igramul is in this chasm, and he's got all these webs strewn about to catch his... to catch his prey, and in the webs is a luck dragon. We'll get into him in a minute. And so Igramol talks to Atreyu, and tells Atreyu, the one who really knows everything you need to know about the childlike empress and the nothing, and how to save everybody, is this creature named Uyulala, the Southern Oracle. And so, but it's clear on the other side of the world, and there is no way Atreyu can make it there, either on foot or on horseback or anything. He'll never be able to make it in time. But Igramol also lets slip a little something, which is he lets something slip that Igramol can poison Atreyu with a special kind of venom, and that venom will eventually kill him, but it will also grant him a single wish, which is like a very weird sort of yin and yang thing. And so now the luck dragon, who is ensnared in the webs down below, his name is Falkor, who is probably most people's favorite character. He overhears this, and so Atreyu agrees to be stung in order to wish himself to the Southern Oracle, knowing that even if he's going to die, at least he'll be able to continue the quest. And so Dwayne is saying, plan to die but wish first. Yes. That's like, it's a very bizarre but very interesting plot device, this venom, where it will kill you, but it will grant you a wish. And so Atreyu agrees to take the venom, he agrees to be stung, and then wish himself to the Southern Oracle. But Falkor overhears that and does exactly the same thing. He rushes to Igramol, gets stung, and wishes himself to the same place that Atreyu's going to. And once they're there, they're in this sort of deserty area with a couple gnomes. I think they're gnomes. The Nomics. Aravandi saying, I don't suppose you could wish not to die. Well, you could, but that's still only one wish. And if Atreyu were to take the venom and then wish not to die, then he'd still be stuck where he is and would have gone no further. So Dwina is asking, then why get the wish? That's a very good question, and it's one of the sort of very bizarre give and take scenarios in this book. Like, the theme that is very, very prevalent in this whole story is wishing comes with a very high price. But we'll get into that later. But anyway, since Falkor is a luck dragon, he happens to bring about a nice workaround to this whole, I'm going to the Southern Oracle, but I'm going to die of horrible venom, which is they run into the Nomics. It's a husband and wife team. The wife happens to be a tremendously good physician, and she's able to whip up an anti-venom for both of them. So so the wife, she's able to create an anti-venom for both Atreyu and Falcor, and they spend some time recovering, and that's when Atreyu begins talking to the husband, whose name is Inkiwook. And the wife has a name, I just can't remember it. Let me see if I can find it real quick. The Nomics. Give me a second. Okay. Yes, his name is Engiwook, and the wife's name is Urgle. So, that's why I couldn't remember that name, because it sounds more like an utterance than a name. So Engiwook is a scientist who has spent his entire life studying the Southern Oracle. And in order to get to Uyulala in the center of the Southern Oracle, you have to pass through 3 gates. The first is the gate of the Sphinx, which are these 2 sphinxes that are staring at each other. And the thing with sphinxes is they are the keepers and purveyors of all the riddles in the world. That's what sphinxes do, and the fact that they're staring at each other means that Light of the King is saying, I was picturing them like Princess Bride's Miracle Max and Valerie, the way they argued. It's true, like that. They do snipe back and forth quite a lot in this, because Engiwook is like, I finally have somebody who can fulfill my dreams of going to the Southern Oracle and bringing me back all this data. And the wife and Urgle is screaming, but he has poison in him. He needs to recover. So there's a lot of back and forth between them, and it's really a lot of fun. So, but eventually Atreyu agrees to go to the Southern Oracle, but he has to pass through these 3 gates. Now, the Sphinx Gate are these 2 sphinxes that are staring at each other, and as they stare at each other, they have this beam of all the riddles in the world passing between them. And what makes this scene so bizarre is anybody who tries to pass between them, unless the sphinxes close their eyes, they're going to get caught up in that stream of riddles. Light of the King is saying, if you drive down the 605 here in LA, there's a shopping center with 2 huge sphinxes on top of the entrance. Scary. Is that the 605 freeway? I thought it was on the 405. I could be misremembering, because I know I've seen that shopping center, and it is a very bizarre shopping center. But I can't focus on that too much. So the way the sphinxes work is, for you to pass between them, they have to close their eyes and shut off the stream of riddles passing between them. Light of the King is saying the Citadel. Okay, yeah, the Citadel. Yeah, I know that place. Drive by there whenever I go down to Disneyland. So, Temple saying that would be a lot of work to enter a mere shopping mall. Yeah, I don't think you have to worry about that happening with the shopping mall. But the thing with the sphinxes is if you get caught up in this beam of riddles between them, then basically your brain just shuts down because all it can do is ponder these riddles and try to figure everything out, and it won't let you pass until you have answered correctly every single riddle known to humankind. And so um and so of course nobody has done that, and so around the sphinxes are lots of dead bodies of people who just stood there until they rotted away. And now Enkiwook does say that there have been people who have made it through, but it's very arbitrary. It's almost like the sphinxes decide themselves whether or not you are worthy of passing between them. um, and then beyond that is the mirror gate, which is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a mirror, and you have to face your darkest, deepest mirror version of yourself, and that's a pretty harrowing thing to do. And then the last one is the no key gate, which is a door with no lock, no key, but it just won't open, and it's up to you to figure out how to open it. Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how Atreyu made it through the no key gate. Okay. Okay. Light of the King is saying, I thought it was interesting how the gnomes knew about all the gates. I guess some people who had gotten through came back to the gnomes afterwards. Yeah, and Enkiwook does explain that he's sent... The people have gone through and come back and reported to him. It's not just a bunch of people going and never coming back. There are people who have come back and reported to Enkiwook, and there have been people who have gone through all three gates and gotten to the Southern Oracle. But for those few people who have actually made it all the way and come back, for some reason they're not willing to tell him what exactly happened. What? Did the show just shut down? I don't think so. Okay, let's try restarting it. See what happens. Okay, I've started the stream again. Hopefully people can see me now. Can you? Okay. Huh, that was weird. Okay, so I just restarted the stream, and that seemed to fix everything. So, and commercials. Go figure. So, I'll give it a second. Give it a second for everybody. Okay. Now I think we're okay. That was a little bizarre. Not sure what happened there. So before the Mishigas happened, Light of the King was asking if there were any, if anybody had gone through and come back, because Enkiwook clearly had all this information on the Southern Oracle. And he does explain to Atreyu that there have been people who have gone through and come back. And some have made it. Some have made it past the Sphinxes. Some got stuck at the Mirror Gate. Some got stuck at the No Key Gate, and they've come back. but then there have been some who have made it all the way through and gotten to the Southern Oracle and seen what was there and spoken to what was there and come back. And the big frustrating thing for Enkiwook is all those people who have gone all the way and come back have never told him what is beyond the No Key Gate. They've never told him what is actually in the Southern Oracle, what Uyulala has to say to them. And it's completely frustrating for him because this is like the last piece of the puzzle for him. And so Atreyu agrees, I'll go through it, I'll talk to the Southern Oracle, and I will report back to you everything that I hear, see, and do. And so Atreyu does it. Gwyn is saying secrets are sometimes good. It's not so much that they're keeping a secret so much as it's very hard to formulate into words what is happening. But we'll get into that. He goes through the Sphinx Gate. They do close their eyes and let him pass. And he goes to the Mirror Gate, and it's in the mirror. This is when things start to sort of the walls between Bastion's world and Fantastica begin to start to crumble away a little bit, because what Atreyu sees in the mirror and what is described in the book that Bastion is reading is Bastion himself. So Bastion is sitting there reading this book that is describing him in a mirror in a fantastical world. Like not just him, but him in the school attic, sitting on the floor, sitting on gym mats, reading the book. Like, it's describing him precisely as he is in that moment. And that really throws him. But and Atreyu doesn't know what this means. It makes no sense to him. But he passes through the Mirror Gate and then gets to the No Key Gate. And it's one of the No Key Gate is one of those sort of almost like a leap of faith kind of things, because it has no handle, it has no lock, it has no key. It's just a door, and the only way to get in is to pass through the door. And so Atreyu is sitting there, like, trying to figure it out. He's trying to see if there's a puzzle to it or something. And finally, like, he's at the end. He's just ready to just give up and go back, because there's clearly nothing he can do. But just for the heck of it, he decides he's just going to go and touch the door. And when he does that, it opens slightly. And it feels almost like it's a living thing. And so Atreyu opens the door and passes through into the Southern Oracle, where he meets Uyulala. And this Uyulala is a very bizarre kind of creature. Because, first of all, she's a disembodied voice. Light of the King is asking, after the Mirror Gate, is that where he forgets everything, sort of? Kind of. Because, yeah, I think, yeah, he does mention somewhere that he does, I don't think he loses his memory until after speaking to Uyulala. or before speaking to Uyla. I'm trying to think here. Okay, yeah. No, you're right. Light of the King. He does lose his memory, but he loses it when he enters into the Southern Oracle. So he's in this gigantic room that's full of pillars. It's this giant empty room that seems to go on forever, and he can't remember anything about himself, how he got there, who he is, what he's doing. And he's hearing this disembodied voice that's speaking to him in rhyming couplets. As Light of the King says, poems! and and Atreyu tries to talk to her, but he's getting no response. And then Uyulala finally says to him in poetic form that she can only hear him if he responds as in poetry, in rhyming couplets. And so they have this whole conversation in rhyming couplets going back and forth with Atreyu trying to piece together who he is and what his quest is, why he's there, Uyulala filling him in and then telling him everything he needs to know. And so it's this very weird back and forth of just poem after poem after poem. And I'm not going to go through all the poems because there are tons of them, and it's an entire conversation in poetry, and it is a fascinating thing to read. But I'll just give you the gist of it, which is the childlike empress. The nothing is being caused by the childlike empress being sick and dying, and the only thing that can bring her back is somebody giving her a new name. But it can't be anybody who gives her a new name. It needs to be a child from beyond the boundaries of Fantastica. You see, I almost said Fantasia. It's Fantastica. I believe that's yeah. And then yeah. So it has to be a child from the human realm outside Fantastica. That's the person who needs to give the childlike empress a new name, and then by doing so, they'll be able to rebuild Fantastica. and so Atreyu doesn't really know how to do this, of course. And also Uyulala tells him that as they finish this conversation, this is the last conversation she will ever have. She is going into the nothing. And of course, at this point, reading this, Bastian starts to think, I could help them. It's like, thought Bastian, how gladly I would help her. Her and Atreyu too. What a beautiful name I would think up. If only I knew how to reach Atreyu, I'd go this minute. Wouldn't he be amazed if I were suddenly standing before him? But it's impossible. Or is it? And then he said under his breath, if there's any way of my getting to you in Fantastica, tell me, Atreyu. I will come without fail. You'll see. And so Bastian, suddenly realizes, this seems to be tied to him, and he's getting into the story. So he says this, but it's almost kind of like an empty thing, or it's like one of those things you think when you're really into reading a story. It's like, well, I can do this, I can help them out here, when of course you can't. This is a fictional story. And so And so Atreyu goes back. Later the king is saying, I actually found a number of Hobbit and Once Upon a Time similarities in this book. Interesting. I mean, the Hobbit similarities I can definitely see. Once Upon a Time, I'll be honest, I kind of gave up on that a few seasons ago, so I don't really know how well it's connected anymore. But I mean, I can certainly see the connection between like the real world and the fictional world, and how the fictional world is its own alternate dimension that, if you do the right thing, you can have access to it, which is kind of how this story plays out. And so, Atreyu goes back and goes to Falkor, and he's trying to puzzle out how he can find the boundaries of Fantastica. And the best thing he can think of is to go to a group of people called the Wind Giants, and these are kind of like the Stone Giants in The Hobbit, where these are gigantic storms, one from the east, one from the north, one from the south, and one from the west, and they are constantly battling each other all over Fantastica. And so Atreyu believes that if there's anybody who knows where the boundaries of Fantastica is, they will, and he can probably get them to stop fighting long enough to tell him, because he's wearing the Orin, the symbol of the childlike empress. Now, there are good creatures and there are bad creatures in Fantastica, but all of them defer to the power of the childlike empress. When they see the Orin, everybody gets on the same page and says, whatever she wants, I will do that. I defer to her in all things. Doesn't matter how good or how evil you are. That is the one main constant in Fantastica. So he goes to these Wind Giants and gets them to stop their battle for just a second, and asks them, where are the boundaries of Fantastica? And that's when, and one by one, all of them say, well, I've never found a boundary. Nope, I've never found one. Nope, me neither. And so all four of them, they've been all over the world, and they've never seen an end to it. So the four winds get back together and start fighting again, and this throws Atreyu and Falkor out into chaos, and that's when they get separated, and Atreyu loses the Orin and gets washed up on a beach. And on the beach, Atreyu finds this area called Spook City, which is sort of like the home of all the ghosts and creatures and all the evil creatures in Fantastica. This is their home. It's called Spook City, and it's completely empty. It's been completely emptied out, except for one creature, this wolf, that's been chained up, and he's clearly starved. He's malnourished, and he's basically been left to die. And Atreyu begins talking to him, and this creature is called Gamork. And Gamork tells him this story about how he was tracking this warrior for the childlike empress, to try to stop him, to try to kill him before he can get to wherever he needs to go to stop the Nothing. Like, Gamork is like the only creature in Fantastica that is actually working against the childlike Empress. And Atreyu is being very cautious here and not telling him who he is. He says, I guess I'm nobody. And so, but Gamork lost his track, lost his trail, of course, probably around the time when Atreyu wished himself to the other side of the world. And so Gamork is sort of wandering around aimlessly, and he stumbles into Spook City, where he is deceived by the princess who rules it, named Gaia, and she chains him up, and then she begins to lead everybody into the nothing. And yes, Light of the King is saying he was half and half, part Fantastica and part other worlds. Yeah, he's Gamork is actually a werewolf, and a werewolf is half and half. He's part human and he's part Fantastican. And what he's doing is he's trying to keep Fantastica from being built up again. The way he says it is, you know only Fantastica. There are other worlds, the world of humans, for instance. But there are creatures who have no world of their own, but are able to go in and out of many worlds. I am one of those. In the human world, I appear in human form, but I'm not human. And in Fantastica, I take on a Fantastican form, but I'm not one of you. And so Atreyu asks him, well, if you've been to the human world, how do you get there? And that's when Gamork tells him, like, there is a gate to get to the human world, but if you, as a Fantastican, go to the human world, you will become something else entirely, and you won't be able to complete your quest. And you won't be able to come back. And then so Atreyu asks him, well, what do I become if I go into the world of humans? And Gamork tells him, you become a lie. Because Fantastica is a realm of imagination, and if a creature from Fantastica comes into the human world, they become the dark version of imagination, which is a lie, an untruth. And that's how he would live out the rest of his lives, basically sort of killing off imagination in America by sowing the seeds of deceit, or in the human world by sowing the seeds of deceit. And so Atreyu asks him, well, where is this gate to the human world? And that's when Gamork says, it's all around you. It's the nothing. If you fall into the nothing, you'll wind up in the human world. And here's what Gamork says. You ask me what you will be, but what are you here? What are you, creatures of Fantastica? Dreams, poetic inventions, characters in a never-ending story. Do you think you're real? Well, yes, here in your world you are. But you've been But when you've been through the nothing, you won't be real anymore. You'll be unrecognizable, and you will be in another world. In that world, you Fantasticans won't be anything like yourselves. You will bring delusion and madness into the human world. Tell me, Sonny, what do you suppose will become of all the Spook City folk who have jumped into the nothing? They will become delusions in the minds of human beings, fears where there is nothing to fear, desires for vain, hurtful things, despairing thoughts where there is no reason to despair. Like the king is saying, thought Gamork had interesting commentary on human world. He's like the Fantasyland buzzkill. Yeah, he kind of is. Um, and so, and Gamork tells him that because so many of these creatures are going into the nothing and going into the human world and becoming fear and deceit and despair, that the humans are shunning their imaginations in Fantastica and thus is feeding the nothing more. So it's almost like a feedback loop of negativity. And Light of the King is saying Gamork's words were the author's commentary on how some people in the world may view fantasy. And yeah, it's true. Like this bit here. That's why humans hate Fantastica and everything that comes from here. They want to destroy it, and they don't realize that by trying to destroy it, they multiply the lies that keep flooding the human world. For these lies are nothing other than creatures of Fantastica who have ceased to be themselves and survive only as living corpses, poisoning the souls of men with their fetid smell. But humans don't know it. Isn't that a good joke? So Gamork is like, he's almost like happy about this. Like he's tickled by this. But at the same time, finally, Atreyu reveals himself as Atreyu and says, "I'm the one you've been searching for." And then they have a very quick battle, because Gamork is weakened, but Atreyu is still able to kill him, but not before Gamork takes a bite out of him. And so Gamork in his last minute, his last act is to take a bite out into Atreyu and basically lock his jaws in on his leg and trap Atreyu there in Spook City as the nothing is closing in. So now, while all this is going on, Falkor is flying over the ocean, and he's able to spot, because he's a luck dragon, of course, he's able to find the Orin, which has fallen off of Atreyu, and he goes down into the ocean and he grabs the Orin, and because he has the Orin now, he's able to home in on Atreyu. And so he goes to Spook City, brings the Orin to Atreyu. And Light of the King is saying Gamork in the movie was a little cheeseball 1984 special effects, but in the movie, Gamork does not bite Atreyu's leg. No. In the movie, Atreyu just kills Gamork, and then the nothing, which is not really a nothing in the movie, because in the movie, the nothing is sort of encapsulated as like this gigantic storm that is slowly taking over the world. And so when he is there in Spook City, the storm comes in and basically starts pulling everything apart. Um, and so Falcor gives the Orin back to Atreyu, and now they know what to do, but they also know that there are no boundaries to Fantasia, and they know that if they try to get Fantastica, he knows that there are no boundaries to Fantastica, and the only way to get to the human world is to go through the nothing, which will turn them into a lie and deception, and they won't be able to get through to a human child to bring them in to save the Empress. And so he realizes, like, the only thing he can do is go back to the Empress and tell him he's failed, or tell her he's failed. And so the childlike Empress, she lives in this place called the Ivory Tower, and at this point is one of the few places left in Fantastica that has not been completely consumed by the nothing. And Atreyu goes to the childlike Empress and tells her, "I failed. There's nothing I can do." And that's when the childlike Empress says to him, there's been a human watching us this whole time. And and Atreyu's like, well then, why did I go on this quest? Why did I go through all of this? Why did I lose my horse? Why did I go through this horrible ordeal? And she says, in order to entice the human boy to read the story. Like, you had to go on an adventure to draw in a human child to read this story and to witness Fantastica. And she also goes by a couple other names. The other title that the childlike Empress has that I absolutely love is the Golden-Eyed Commander of Wishes. And so Bastian realizes now that this is clearly about him, and that all he needs to do is call out a name for the childlike Empress, and he can save Fantastica and he can change the world. But she also says that by doing that, he'll be drawn into it. And Bastian is very hesitant about this because there's a part of his brain that's saying there is no way this can possibly be real. And there's another part of his brain that is saying, if it is real, what the hell am I doing? Do I really want to be pulled into this fantastic world if I do this? And so he hesitates, and he's not willing to call it out. And so that's when the childlike Empress has to do her own special thing, which is she goes off to she goes to meet this guy, and I'm trying to remember his name. He is the Old Man of the Wandering Mountain. She has to go to him and speak to him. Now, the Old Man of Wandering Mountain is this man who lives up in this mountain that, of course, it's wandering, so it's constantly shifting location, as are most things in Fantastica. But this is another one of those locations that is sort of impervious to the nothing. And he lives in this mountain in this room that is basically like an egg-shaped room. And what he does there is he's the transcriber of the Neverending story. He's the one who is writing everything down. And as he writes everything in his book, it is coming to be in the Neverending storybook in our world. And so she tells him, she basically forces him into this feedback loop where he begins writing the story again from the beginning, from the point of Bastian entering the bookstore, and he starts writing it again. And then when he gets to this point, he goes back and starts writing it again. And then when they get to that point, he goes back and starts writing it again, and it becomes this loop of just telling the story over and over and over and over again, until finally Bastian can't take it anymore and screams out her name. And the name he gives her is Moonchild. Now, this is the funny story that I have. What is it? Lady of the King saying, I thought it made such a strong statement about bullying that this story was able to lift Bastian out of feeling awkward for creating these stories. He now knew that his stories had power and purpose. It gave him strength to stand up to those loser bullies. Well, in the movie, it does that. In the book, things take on a very different angle. But anyway, like the whole thing with the name Moonchild. Now, in the movie, Bastian does scream out the name Moonchild eventually, after in a much more truncated scene where essentially the childlike empress breaks the fourth wall in the story and begins pleading to Bastian directly through the book. And Bastian finally, after hearing her plead with him, he goes out and calls out her name. Now, in the movie, it was like probably a combination of the way he said it, the sound effects, because there's a storm going on outside. I couldn't understand what the hell he was saying. And so for the longest time, I thought that he had deliberately been told to just scream out some sort of nonsense word that sounds almost like a name, but not quite, in order for her to be given a name, but it not being like just the most beautiful name ever, because that's the way he describes it in the movie. In the movie, he says that this was his mother's name, and that it was the most beautiful name he'd ever heard in his life. And so I thought that it was deliberately him screaming out a nonsense word that you couldn't really make out. But in truth, if you go back and watch the movie and you know the name is Moonchild, you can clearly hear him screaming out Moonchild. And so Temple was asking, I thought in the movie he gave her his mother's name. And no, you're right. In the movie it was his mother's name, but that's not the case in the book. In the book, it's a name he makes up. And so in calling out the name Moonchild, everything explodes, and Bastian is drawn into Fantastica. Okay, that's kind of funny. So it's here that he finally meets Moonchild for real. And she gives him this grain of sand, which is the one piece of Fantastica that's left, and gives him a job. And that job is for him to wish Fantastica back into existence. And with each wish he makes, he will create a new world, a new area of Fantastica. And so the new Fantastica will basically be rebuilt in his image. And he's also, one of the things in this book is that Bastian is also very self-conscious about his looks. He's an overweight kid. He's a short, fat kid, and he's worried about how he's gonna look and that was part of his hesitation, was like, why would the childlike Empress want to entrust Fantastica with this dumpy kid like me? And that's when Moonchild tells him, well, that's maybe how you see yourself, but this is how I see you. And he sees this vision of this sort of like this very elegant, regal sultan like character. And so he goes into Fantastica taking on that guise, and he begins wishing. Now this is when we get into the part of the book that is not in the movie, because in the movie, at this point, he uses his first wish to go through Fantastica, and he sees Atreyu from afar. Artax is alive again. He's riding on Falkor. He sees all the characters that he's encountered through the story, and they're all living great lives. And then he uses his next wish to go back into the human world and basically exact revenge on the bullies by bringing in Falkor with him and chasing the kids down an alley. And then from there, the story ends. Then from there, the movie ends. Now, in the book, once Bastian is in Fantastica, he can't get out. He can't return to the human world. He's got to stay there in Fantastica, and he's got to rebuild it. And so this is so he begins wishing for various things, and with each wish comes a new creature or a new area or a new character, usually with some sort of unintended consequences. Like, he'll wish for some sort of creature that he can fight, and so a dragon appears, but the dragon also wipes out a town and kills a whole bunch of people. And also, with each wish he makes, he starts losing memories of his life before Fantastica, of his life in the human world. And eventually he does meet up with Atreyu and Falkor again, and Atreyu and Falkor sort of see what Bastian is becoming. And yes, Lady of the King, the dragon that he creates is named Smurg. And one of the where is it? Yeah, we kind of gone. Okay. I'm gonna try to go through the rest of this fairly quickly, because we spent a lot of time in the first half, and I would say the first half is probably like the most like certainly more like a mystical adventure like you would expect, whereas the second half is much more a story of self-exploration, because he meets up with Falkor and Atreyu and a whole host of people, and he's trying to get to Moonchild again, because he believes that first of all, there is a rule in Fantastica that you're only ever allowed to meet the childlike empress once in your life. Bastion's already had that meeting. And so he feels that he has the power to change that rule, and so he's going to go to the ivory tower and he's going to see Moonchild again, and she's going to help him make the perfect Fantastica. And so through this, as he's doing all of this wishing, he's losing himself and he's becoming more and more egotistical, more and more ambitious, and even more warlike. And there's a point where he wishes for a truly evil villain. Like the dragon Smurg is a terrible villain, but it's also one that could easily be killed with force. He wants a real challenge, and so he ends up meeting this sorceress named, I don't even know how to pronounce this name. It's got a very weird spelling, so I'm going to try my best. Zaida. It's spelled Xayide. And she actually begins to deceive him and to trick him into making more wishes. And Atreyu and Falcor are starting to see that she's got a hold on him, and they try to wedge Bastion away from her, but Bastion is already too much into this, and Zaida has convinced Bastion that Atreyu and Falcor are actually conspiring against him to steal the Orin. And so he banishes Atreyu and Falcor. And then eventually Bastion and his huge host, they get to the ivory tower, but they can't get to the childlike empress. They can't get to Moonchild. And Light of the King is saying she reminded me of the queen in Narnia who corrupted Edmund. And yeah, like it's a lot like that. It's a lot like the White Queen or the Ice Queen. And Zaida is very much that way. And since they can't get to the childlike empress, Bastion decides, well then, she must be gone, therefore I am now the Emperor of Fantastica. I declare myself childlike Emperor. And that's when Atreyu comes in with a resistance movement, and there's a huge battle. And eventually Zaida is killed, everybody is scattered, and Bastion is cast out. He's gone. He's lost so much of himself at this point that now it's become more of him trying to find a way back. And so he goes on this very... This is where the story takes a very weird turn, because in order for him to... now he's gotten to the point where he can still wish as much as he wants, but he's lost so much of himself that in order for him to get back to where he needs to be, he needs to make more wishes, but he's lost so much of himself that by wishing more, he risks losing himself entirely. And so this is what I was talking about with wishes come at a price. And it's at this point now that Bastion almost has completely forgotten himself, and he sees this he goes into this city. It's called the City of the Old Emperors, where it's just lots of crazy people just sort of wandering around, completely distraught, completely detached from reality. and he meets somebody there, and I can't remember who he meets. But because he still has the Orin, he's able to sort of uh, get past this a little bit. But there's a guy there. Okay, his name is Argax, um, and Argax explains to him uh, that these are all people who went through exactly what you went through, and who didn't come out the other end. And this is the consequences of what they've done. They've wished themselves into madness, and this is where they go. And so, because like one of the things that Argax tells Bastion is like, don't think that you're the first person who has tried to take over Fantastica by wishing themselves as into the role of emperor. And okay, Argax is a little monkey. Okay. And so now Bastion sort of knows the consequences of his actions, but he also knows that he still has enough left in him that if he focuses hard enough and he makes just the right amount of moves, he can probably save himself. And so, yeah, I don't want to, because now we're getting into the ending of the story, and I don't want to spoil too much of that, but eventually, like, it comes down to Bastion has wished his last wish. He's completely forgotten himself, or he's down to like just one last thing, and it's just a vague memory. And with his and finally with his last wish, he's able to get himself back to the human world. And it's there when he gets back to the human world that he meets up with his father. Now, in the beginning of the story, his father is somebody who is he's a very detached, depressed person, because he did his mother did die. Bastion's mother did pass away, and his father is very despondent over this and very distant over this, and he never really got over that. And so there's been this kind of I don't want to say rift, but kind of like distance between them, between Bastion and his father, and it's when Bastion comes back that his father realizes, like, we're all we have, and we need to stick together. We need to be a good father and son team. And so they go out, and Bastion tells him everything about what happened, and it sounds ridiculous, but his father is just like, okay, if you say that's what happened, then that's what happened. And he's willing to believe him. And then in the very end, Bastion, he wants to return the Neverending story, the book, to Mr. Coriander, but he can't find it. It's gone. So he decides that even though he can't return it to him, he's going to go to Mr. Coriander and he's going to just fess up to stealing the book. And in talking with Mr. Coriander, he realizes that Coriander himself was also somebody who read the Neverending story, went in, named the childlike empress, went into Fantastica, rebuilt it, and was able to come back out. And so the two of them begin to reminisce over this. And Coriander tells him, like, my whole job after coming back from Fantastica was to pass this on to somebody else, and now it's been passed on to you, and so one day you will pass this on to somebody else when the world needs it. And so that's the never-ending story. And so it really is sort of like, even though this ends, it sort of ends with Bastion taking the mantle of the guy in the very beginning. So this is a story that continues to perpetuate itself. Like, everything that happens in this story is very cyclical. It's all stuff. It's a pattern that has happened before, and it will happen again, and it's this loop that continues, and that's what the never-ending story really means. Like, you go through this wild adventure that you think is entirely your own, but it's actually it's a but it's actually a cycle that continues to perpetuate itself over and over again, and you are just another one in this. Now, Light of the King is mentioning one thing I loved about the book was the chapters being titled from A to Z. That's kind of true. It's not the chapter titles themselves, it's the first letter of the first word of each chapter begins from A to Z. And I don't know if you can see it here, but at the start of each chapter there is a full page illustration of that letter. And so it's actually the first letter of the first word of each chapter that goes from A to Z from chapter to chapter. So, and that's a very clever thing that the writer did. So yeah, that's the never-ending story. Now, one of the things that I found so interesting. Now, okay, I should mention this copy of the book that I have. Whenever anything is happening in a Fantastica, it's just regular type, and when it's in the real world with Bastion, it's italicized. Now, this is sort of a cheaper way of doing it. In other printed versions of the book, the text itself is actually colored differently. And okay, Ava's going to sleep. Bye, Ava. Thank you for dropping in, and thank you for joining in. So, but yeah, I'm gonna bring this to a close pretty quick soon. What I found so interesting about this book is, like, first of all, yeah, maybe about the first third, maybe the first half is what encompasses the movie from 1984. Now, the movie is a great adventure. It's a really well done movie, and if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend it. It's one of those movies that I feel really does hold up and is rather timeless, and in such a way that if you were to remake it today, I think I'd be okay with that. But that isn't to say that the original isn't good too. And it is. I do highly recommend it. Just be prepared. The movie has a theme song that is an incredibly insidious earworm, which I'm not going to sing. But if you know the movie, you know the song, and if you see the movie, you'll hear the song. Don't worry. So, I thought the movie did a good job of sort of changing stuff from the book with like, there were certain things that clearly you couldn't do in mid 80s special effects, like Igramul. Like, we just didn't have the technology back then to do an effect like that and make it believable, which is why instead of having that whole scene with Igramul, instead Atreyu is sort of falling into his own despair in the swamps of sadness, and then randomly out of nowhere Falkor appears and pulls him out, and that's how That's how that gets resolved in the movie. Same thing with the Southern Oracle, because Uyulala is so bizarre. Uh, and also it would be really weird, I think, to have an entire scene in a movie where you have two characters, one of which is a disembodied voice speaking to each other in rhyming couplets only. Um, so instead, what we have is we don't have the no key gate in the movie. We have Atreyu uh, going to a second version of the Sphinxes that basically tell him everything straightforward while they're crumbling apart because they're about to go into the nothing. And also, Atreyu never loses his memory. Um, and then finally, the ending. Um, and there are various other changes, but the ending, it definitely had to be changed in order to give this movie an ending to this story because, or an ending to this part of the story because in the book, this part of the story kind of segues directly into the next part, which is Bastian going into Fantastica and rebuilding it. And so it has a very, I would almost call it a cheesy ending, but it does end with a line that is used over and over in this story, because there are lots of characters that go in and out of the story, and every time like their arc ends or they go off to do something else, he almost always ends their story by saying they they met somebody or they moved on, they had a great adventure, they became great friends with this or just like a little hint at what happens to their life after, but then ends it by saying, but that's another story and it will be told another time. And so that's how the movie ends, with a narrator who has not been in this movie at all suddenly coming in and saying, and Bastian went on and had many great adventures with Atreyu and Falcor and all of his friends in Fantastica, or in Fantasia because it's the movie, before finally coming home and living a regular life. But that's another story. And so like I kind of like the idea of all these characters coming and going, and all their stories ending with they had a good life, they lived this, they had these adventures, but we're not going to get into that right now. And so it sort of keeps you on track. And also I think like there's a very strong sense of like the theme of wishes and magic in this, and how it comes at a very great price, and how if you like, imagination is a wonderful thing and it can do great things, but if you give into it too much or if you lend yourself to it too much, you can lose yourself, which is sort of how this device of Bastian losing his human memories the more he wishes is sort of used. So so I think that that's a really cool device that helps explain like the use of imagination almost in moderation. Like, okay, as Dwina says, happiness comes from being true to yourself. And yeah, that's true because like the more Bastian wishes, the more he becomes a part of Fantastica, the more he loses himself, the more he becomes a villain. And it's only when he's finally brought to the edge, when he has turned on his good friends and he's lost so much of himself, that he's finally slapped in the face with, you will descend into madness if you keep on this path. And so he has to very strongly and very desperately find a way back. I stole the One Ring is saying, wait, has the story ended? Oh, wait. So, now, the other thing that should be mentioned is the movie does have two sequels. There is a Neverending Story Part 2 and a Part 3 movies, uh, both of which are terrible, terrible movies, and also neither of which deal with anything that's in this second half of this book. Maybe there's a little bit in Part 2 that does that sort of mirrors a little bit of what's going on here. For instance, in the movie Part 2, Bastion is able to wish. His his wishing ability does take away a memory, but rather than it being like the nature of wishing in Fantastica, it's a special device that was created specifically to ruin Bastion. And yeah, this is a device, like, apparently his memories are power to this evil sorceress who is supposed she's kind of she's kind of supposed to be like Zaida, but not really, because like her whole plan this entire time is to have this device that will encapsulate all of Bastion's memories and destroy him every time he makes a wish. Meanwhile, Bastion is making just the dumbest wishes while he's in Fantasia. And I mean, he meets up with Falcor and with Atreyu again, but it's very much just like a straight adventure story. They have to work together to fight the evil sorceress. Meanwhile, Bastion is slowly losing himself, and there's also this whole thing with him being afraid of diving off of the high dive, and the only way for him to get back to the human world at the end is for him to dive into a ravine. And Light of the King is mentioning it's sad because it has Jonathan Brandis in it, another child star with a tragic ending, and that's true. And in Part 2, Bastion is played by Jonathan Brandis, who very tragically took his own life many years ago. But I don't want to bring us down too much. But yes, that is a story, and it wasn't that's part of the history of this, but it's also I don't want to imply that him making Neverending Story Part 2 is what did it. There was clearly a lot more going on there, but it was a very tragic ending. And then Part 3, the movie Part 3, stars the kid from Free Willy playing Bastion, and Jack Black playing the school bully. And this is where Part 3, I don't know where the hell they came up with this stuff, but like Bastion is able to bring the Orin into the human world, and the bullies discover the Orin and the Neverending Story, and also discover that they can change Fantasia by writing and telling whatever the hell they want. And so they begin doing that, and so they're starting to destroy the world basically by being just jerks. Meanwhile, Bastion, who now has a sister, his father is remarried, and so he's got a stepsister now. His stepsister finds the Orin, and she realizes that it grants wishes, and so what she does what every girl in the 90s would do with the power to grant wishes: shopping spree. And then the Rockbiter comes in, and he's in the real world, and his kid is in the real world. He's got a baby, and Bastion is trying to keep the baby Rockbiter from being seen by other people, and it's just a mess. It's just an absolute mess of a movie. And so it's kind of disheartening to know that there was a whole second half of this book that tells a really great story, and you have two movie sequels that don't utilize it in any way. And And yeah. And Temple saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, a freaking shopping spree. Maybe if it was at a bookstore." Yeah, it's not. It's obviously not. Yeah, these movies are absolutely dreadful, um, and it's very sad to know that like there is a good story here. Um, uh, Aravandi's saying, "Ooh, bookstore shopping spree. I could do that. I think a lot of us could. Like I've certainly done it, and it's an expensive thing to do. But so so that's the Neverending Story. It's a really great book. Like I really enjoyed this. It's very insightful. Um, it it's a it has a good use of telling you deeper. It's very good at telling you of giving you a much deeper message while still telling a very compelling adventure story. Um, and I would compare it to the most recent Pixar movie, Inside Out, that tells the story of of the emotions inside the head of a girl who was going through a tough time in her life, and it's like their adventures, but also how what is happening to these emotions inside this girl's head are affecting her in the real world, and uh, it's this amazing lesson in human psychology, illustrated with these very colorful and very interesting characters, and the Neverending Story is a lot like that. It's illustrating the power of imagination and the power of words, and also how devastating it can be if you go into it too much. And it's done through this very trippy story. Now, the first half is definitely very much a straightforward adventure, while the second half gets gets very existential, especially towards the end. Um, but it's still very compelling, and the whole time, like you're still here with Bastion, and you're just following him through this whole thing, and you just want him to you want him to get out, and you want him to get back to his real life, because you can't live in an imaginary world all the time. And that's sort of the main message that I take away from the Neverending Story, is that imagination is wonderful, and it's great, and it's such an important part of your life, but you can't live there exclusively as much as you may want to, because it will eventually transform you into something you don't like, or something that is not you. And so yeah, that's the Neverending Story. Um, and if if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen the first movie, I highly recommend the first movie. It still holds up today. Um, I think this is one of those stories, one of those movies that is really ripe for a good remake, and I would love to see it done with today's technology. Um, and it's also, for those of us who have seen it, it's a good bit of nostalgia. I did listen to, from reading it here, I also listened to the audiobook, which is available on Audible. And the narrator almost sounds like he has a vocal cadence that is kind of like he's telling you a bedtime story, um, which works in some places, but not through the entirety of this book. Um, but I would still recommend it. It's still compelling enough. So yeah, that's the Neverending Story by Michael End. It's not a terribly long read. It's not a terribly hard read. Um, so yeah, I do recommend it. I think it was a really good time. It was a really well constructed story. So, with our book of the month now being discussed and done, uh, We are going to have another book of the month for July, and that is another. It's going to be another little bit of a nostalgia trip for a lot of us '80s kids. That book is The Princess Bride by William Goldman. And I saw some people had been talking about The Princess Bride in our discussion of the Neverending Story. And this was a movie that came out roughly about the same time as the Neverending Story. I think it came out a few years later, or may have come out maybe just a year later, because it just celebrated its 30th anniversary too. So so I thought, yeah, let's do this one. Now, The Princess Bride is one of those books. It's written by William Goldman, and William Goldman wrote the screenplay and the book for The Princess Bride at the same time. And I haven't even gotten into the book yet. I've got it, but I haven't started reading it yet. So I'm looking forward to that one. And Light of the King is saying, I read As You Wish by Carrie Elwes last year. It was so funny and good. That's another one that I do want to read, As You Wish. So yeah, next month we'll be discussing The Princess Bride. I believe that will be on August 2nd is when we'll be discussing it. So that's it for this. I'm looking forward to The Princess Bride. And next week, we'll be back to the Silmarillion. Good old Silmarillion. The gift that keeps on giving. And and next week, we're going to be doing the chapter of Beren and Luthien, which is one of my favorites, and I can't wait to discuss this this chapter with everybody. So I'm looking forward to next week for sure. I'm looking forward to The Princess Bride. Looking forward to Comic-Con in a couple of weeks. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to enjoy in the coming weeks. So yeah, that's it for this week. I will see you all next Sunday to discuss Beren and Luthien, and never stop reading.